little changes will lead to major weight loss success. Now, I know some of you out there are going to say, no, wait a minute, Kayla, your changes were huge. You went from eating 5 or 6 meals a day down to 1 meal a day. You went from being sedentary to walking 6 miles every day, and those were huge changes. But I would like to point out that those huge changes were just made up of tiny little changes. So let's back up. My behavior before with weight loss was always just kind of unsustainable. I would try to basically just punish myself and do really difficult things and make it really hard and try to achieve the results really fast. And usually what would end up happening is either I would, lose the weight but then gain it all back, or I would just be so frustrated with the process because it was so hard, I would just give up. But then in January of 2015, I read a book called The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. And the book is about personal success. It's not really about weight loss at all. But in it, the whole overarching idea is if you make small changes and have small little habit changes over time, they compound into major success. So by the end of 2015, the idea in my mind had been marinating a lot of like small changes, but I really hadn't bought into it because I thought, no, you got to have these big, really aggressive goals. You got to really hit them hard. But what had happened was I really hadn't had that much success. I had lost maybe 15 pounds or so, but I had plateaued for a long time, and I was actually seeing the numbers start to creep back up. And so I sat down and I really kind of had this moment where I realized I'm doing the same thing over and over again. That's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I was just being unsustainable. Like I was, tracking every workout and, trying to enter in and calculate the calorie burn, and then I was counting my calories. I was even weighing my food, and I was being really obsessive and just unsustainable because I knew deep down I'm not going to stick with any of these changes. So instead, I said, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to try just making small, sustainable changes. And I'm just going to have to be okay with the idea that maybe this is going to be a really long, slow process. But I really wanted it to be something I could live with for the rest of my life. So here's what I found about this process is it's really neat because even though you're setting the bar low, which is kind of counterintuitive for me because I tend to try to set the bar really high, set the bar low on purpose, and then you're able to jump over it. So you start stacking up these victories like, oh, I did that. Oh, I accomplished that. And pretty soon you look around and you say, hey, I've really made progress. So I'll give you some examples of the way I used tiny changes to really make a big difference in my life. So let's talk about intermittent fasting, right? I started out, eating 5-6 times a day and just having that normal kind of eating pattern. And what I did, I just slowly pushed out my eating window further and further. So I just started, with a little bit later of a breakfast. I mean, it was barely even a fast, really. It was barely anything. And it probably took me 8 or 9 months to get to the point where I was eating once a day. And, you're right. I probably could have gone from eating, 5 or 6 meals a day down to eating once a day, just like overnight. But because I did it this way, really slowly and intentionally, and with very little perceived effort on my part, it made it this ingrained habit, and it just made it like almost effortless. And another example of just a tiny change was with my step count. So I started out, for one thing, setting the bar low for me was just saying, I'm just going to walk. Like, I'm not going to do a really hard workout or anything. It's just going to be walking. And then I was able to increase my step goal. And when I realized, I was at a point where it's like I could do a little bit more, or, I could be a little more consistent, I just kept working up until I got to the point where I said, okay, 6 miles every day. And I've been able to do that. And then the last example, and this is probably the most important piece to me, was I decided to be a little bit nicer to myself. So in the process of reading all these, self-help books and all that, I got introduced to the idea of, your inner dialogue, paying attention to the story that you're telling to yourself about yourself. So I noticed and started to recognize I was really negative toward myself. I was saying mean things to myself. And so I decided, okay, I'm just going to be a little bit nicer, and just telling myself I'm going to be a little bit nicer to myself today. That has really helped to really change my, my outlook and just how I feel about myself. So instead of just setting up this huge goal of like, I'm just never going to say another bad, mean thing to myself again, I just said, I want to be a little bit nicer. And so that, it started out just by recognizing when I was saying negative things to myself, to eventually trying to say, well, is there truth to it? And can I, improve on what I'm doing? And then also just replacing those negative comments, saying, okay, if I notice myself saying a negative thing about myself, I'm just going to, compliment myself like 5 times. So I'm curious to know, what are some tiny changes that you've made in your life that have really made a big difference? And maybe it's not even about weight loss. Maybe it's a tiny little change you made to your routine or your week or whatever. I'm always curious to learn from other people. So thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below.